A man checks into a hospital for depression. He doesn't check out the same person. Not because of the treatment, not because of the medication his doctor prescribed, but because, without his knowledge, without his signature, without a single piece of paper connecting what was about to happen to anything resembling consent, someone decided he was useful for something else entirely. This is not a story about the Soviet Union. It is not set in a gulag or a secret police basement, or any of the places we have agreed it is acceptable to locate this kind of horror. It is set in a university hospital in Montreal, funded, in part, by the United States government. We know this because of a box of retirement files. The standard version of this story ends with exposure, accountability, reform. A rogue program uncovered, a congressional hearing, a cautionary tale filed neatly into the past where it can be visited without discomfort. That version is wrong. Not about the facts. The facts are confirmed. 150 subprojects, 80 institutions, 20 years. The CIA's own director testified to it under oath in 1977. What the standard version gets wrong is the ending. There was no ending. In 1994, 41 years after the program began, a man named Eric Olson had his father's body dug up from a cemetery in Maryland. His father had worked for the CIA. His father had died in 1953, falling from a 13th floor window in New York. The official ruling had always been suicide. The forensic examination found something on the left side of the skull, something that wasn't consistent with a fall. And in 1977, the Senate hearing that confirmed everything, the drugs, the hospitals, the patients who woke up not knowing their own children, that hearing also produced a number that has never been fully accounted for. The documents that survived represent 20% of the total. The other 80% was shredded on a single morning in January 1973. What was in it, we will never know. What's in the 20% that survived is enough to change how you think about the word oversight, and what it actually means when the people doing the overseeing are the same people running the program. That's what this is about. Not conspiracy, not theory. On the morning of January 31st, 1973, Richard Helms ordered the destruction of every file related to a program called MKUltra. He had 2 days before his scheduled testimony before the United States Congress. The shredders ran for hours. What Helms didn't know, what nobody in the operation apparently thought to check, was that a portion of the financial records had been stored in a separate building, a budget archive, the kind of paperwork that accountants keep and intelligence officers ignore. Those boxes survived.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
In 1977, a CIA employee named John Grennan located them during a routine records search. He wasn't looking for MKUltra. He was auditing retirement files. According to the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence report, published that same year, the discovery was, in their words, accidental. Accidental. The most consequential intelligence disclosure of the Cold War era happened because someone was checking retirement paperwork. Those financial records, 16,000 pages of budget requests, payment authorizations, and internal correspondence, became the foundation of the 1977 Senate hearings that confirmed what the CIA had spent 2 days trying to erase. Not alleged, not suspected, confirmed, on the record, under oath, by the agency's own director at the time, Stansfield Turner. What the documents showed wasn't a rogue experiment. It wasn't a handful of scientists operating outside official channels. It was a structured, funded, administratively managed program running across 80 institutions, universities, hospitals, prisons, with a formal budget line and a project number. 150 subprojects. The number appears in the Senate report with no drama. Just a number in a list. 150 separate operations, each with its own funding authorization, its own institutional partner, its own objectives. The program didn't look like a secret. It looked like a department. What the financial records couldn't tell the Senate, what they still can't tell anyone, is what was in the files that didn't survive. The 16,000 pages represent, by the CIA's own estimate, approximately 20% of the original documentation. There are boxes, financial records, stored in a separate building. Helms didn't know about them. The other 80% is gone. To understand what MKUltra was, you have to understand what the United States believed it was facing in 1950. The Korean War had just begun. American prisoners of war were returning from Chinese and Soviet captivity and saying things that made no sense. Men who had been decorated soldiers were confessing to crimes they hadn't committed. Officers were denouncing their own country in front of cameras, calmly, without visible coercion. The term that entered the public vocabulary was brainwashing, a translation of a Chinese phrase, "xi nao," first used by journalist Edward Hunter in a 1950 CIA-funded article in the Miami News. The fear was specific, that the Soviet Union and China had developed a technology of the mind, a method to rewrite a person's beliefs, loyalties, and memory, without surgery, without obvious physical torture. Just chemistry and psychology, applied in the right sequence. The CIA didn't dismiss this as science fiction. They funded it as a national security priority. In April 1953, CIA Director Allen Dulles formally authorized a program under the codename MKUltra. The operational memo, declassified and available in the National Security Archive, describes the objective in bureaucratic language that barely conceals what it's actually saying. The development of materials and methods capable of producing exploitable alteration of personality. The program would be run by the technical services staff under a chemist named Sidney Gottlieb, a man with a PhD from Caltech, a stutter, a club foot, and, by all surviving accounts, an extraordinary belief in what science could accomplish. Gottlieb's mandate was straightforward: find out if mind control was real. And if it was, build it first. The official history, as it's been taught and repeated, frames MKUltra as a product of its time, a Cold War overreaction. Paranoid, excessive, but comprehensible given what American intelligence believed it was up against. The Church Committee Report of 1975, the first congressional investigation, described the program as a response to genuine security concerns, conducted by men who believed they were protecting their country. That framing is not wrong. It's just incomplete. What the official record confirms, and what no one thought to check for 2 decades, is a detail buried in the same budget documents that everyone cited as proof the program had ended. The program was never limited to studying what the Soviets might already have. It was designing something new. By 1957, MKUltra had expanded beyond interrogation research into active behavioral modification. Subprojects were running at McGill University in Montreal, at the Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, at Stanford, at Columbia. Each institution received funding through front organizations, foundations with legitimate-sounding names that existed solely to route CIA money without triggering academic ethics review. The universities, in most cases, didn't know where the money came from. The researchers, in some cases, didn't know what they were actually testing. The subjects, in almost every documented case, had no idea they were part of an experiment at all. The program officially ended in 1973. That's the date in every textbook. The date Helms ordered the files destroyed. The date the CIA told itself the story was over. The surviving documents list 150 subprojects. Subproject 68 has a different kind of paperwork. Test subjects. That's the phrase in the documents. Not patients, not volunteers, not research participants. Test subjects. Subproject 68 was run by a psychiatrist named Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal, a facility attached to McGill University, one of the most respected medical institutions in the English-speaking world. Cameron was not a fringe figure. He was the first president of the World Psychiatric Association. He had testified at the Nuremberg trials as an expert witness on the psychology of Nazi war criminals. He knew, better than almost anyone alive, what it looked like when medicine was used as a weapon. According to the CIA financial records recovered in 1977, Subproject 68 received funding between 1957 and 1960 through a front organization called the Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology. Cameron's stated research objective was something he called psychic driving, a technique involving the erasure of existing personality patterns and their replacement with new ones. In practice, it worked like this. Patients admitted to the Allen Memorial Institute for conditions as ordinary as anxiety and mild depression were placed into drug-induced sleep for weeks at a time, some for months. According to the testimony of surviving patients before the Canadian Senate in 1977, the sleep periods ranged from 15 to 65 days. During that time, they were subjected to electroconvulsive therapy at voltages 20 to 40 times higher than standard medical practice. They were kept in sensory deprivation, and they were exposed to looped audio recordings, messages played through speakers or under their pillows, repeating hundreds of thousands of times. Cameron called it de-patterning. The patients called it, in the words of one survivor who testified before the Canadian Parliament, waking up not knowing my own children's names. She hadn't consented to an experiment. She had checked in for depression. The crack in the official story isn't that the CIA ran illegal experiments. The Church Committee confirmed that in 1975. The crack is something more specific. The institutional architecture that made it possible. Cameron didn't operate in a basement. He operated in a university hospital, with academic credentials, with ethics board oversight that somehow never flagged what he was doing, with CIA money routed through a foundation that appeared, on paper, entirely legitimate. The system didn't fail. The system worked exactly as designed. In 1988, the Canadian government paid $100,000 Canadian dollars in compensation to each of Cameron's surviving victims, 77 people in total. The United States government settled a civil lawsuit with 9 Canadian plaintiffs in 1988 for an undisclosed amount, without admitting liability. The settlements were quiet. There were no press conferences. And then there's Frank Olson. Frank Olson was a bacteriologist. He worked for the U.S. Army at Fort Detrick, Maryland, the Army's biological weapons research facility. He had a security clearance. He had a wife and 3 children. He had, by all accounts, spent his career doing exactly what his country asked of him. On November 19, 1953.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Olson attended a CIA retreat at a cabin in western Maryland. At some point during the weekend, Sidney Gottlieb added a dose of LSD to the Cointreau served after dinner. He waited 20 minutes before telling the group what he had done. Frank Olson had never taken LSD. He hadn't agreed to take it. He wasn't told it was coming. According to the Senate report and the subsequent investigation by journalist Seymour Hersh, Olson's behavior changed dramatically in the days that followed. He became withdrawn, agitated, unable to work. His CIA supervisor arranged for him to see a New York psychiatrist. On November 28, 1953, 9 days after the drugging, Frank Olson fell from the window of his room on the 13th floor of the Statler Hotel in Manhattan. The official ruling: suicide. His wife was told her husband had jumped from a window during a mental breakdown. She was not told about the LSD. She was not told about the CIA. She was given a government pension and asked, in the characteristically quiet language of these things, to move on. She moved on. Her children did not. In 1975, the Rockefeller Commission, investigating CIA domestic operations, included a single paragraph about an unnamed Army employee who had died after being given LSD without his knowledge. Frank Olson's son Eric read it in a newspaper. He recognized his father. The Ford administration invited the Olson family to the White House. President Ford apologized personally. The CIA director at the time, William Colby, handed Eric Olson a file, a partial file, heavily redacted, and offered a financial settlement. The family accepted $750,000. Eric Olson spent the next 2 decades reading everything he could find. And this is where it gets interesting. In 1994, Eric Olson had his father's body exhumed. The forensic examination was conducted by James Starrs, a professor of forensic science at George Washington University, who assembled a team of specialists. Their findings, published in 1994 and reviewed in the Journal of Forensic Sciences, identified evidence inconsistent with a fall from a window. There was a hematoma on the left side of Frank Olson's skull, above the temple, that Starrs concluded was more consistent with a blunt force impact before the fall than with injuries sustained during it. Starrs's conclusion: the death was a homicide, staged to appear as a suicide. The case was reopened by the Manhattan District Attorney's Office in 1996. It was closed in 1996. Insufficient evidence to prosecute. The CIA has never commented on Starrs's findings. The file William Colby gave the Olson family in 1975 remains partially redacted. Here is what the documents confirm. Between 1953 and 1973, the CIA ran 150 subprojects across 80 institutions. They administered LSD, barbiturates, mescaline, and other substances to people who did not know they were being drugged. They funded the deliberate psychological destruction of patients in a Canadian hospital who had come in for anxiety and depression. They operated, by their own financial records, a program with no ethical oversight, no informed consent, and no mechanism for accountability. Every subproject had a budget authorization. Every budget authorization had a signature. Not one person was ever criminally prosecuted. The Church Committee report noted this in 1975, with the kind of careful, institutional language that makes the fact almost invisible. The committee found that most of the surviving participants in the program have declined to be identified. Read that again. Most of the surviving participants declined to be identified. These were not rogue agents operating in shadows. These were administrators, researchers, department heads, people with offices and salaries and retirement plans, who looked at what they had done and decided, when the time came, that they would prefer not to put their names to it. No court compelled them otherwise. The patients in Montreal never got their memories back. The families of the people dosed without consent never received a full accounting. Frank Olson's son Eric died in 2019, still trying to find out what happened to his father in room 1018A of the Statler Hotel. He never found out. The file is still partially redacted. In 1977, Senator Ted Kennedy opened the Senate hearing on MKUltra with a statement that has been quoted many times since and absorbed almost not at all. He said, "The deputy director of the CIA revealed that over 30 universities and institutions were involved in an extensive testing and experimentation program, which included covert drug tests on unwitting citizens at all social levels, high and low, Native Americans and foreign. The hearing was televised. It was covered by every major newspaper. The CIA director testified under oath. The program was confirmed in its entirety. And then, largely, the world moved on. This is the part of the MKUltra story that gets the least attention. Not what happened, but what didn't happen afterward. No criminal prosecutions. No institutional dismantling. No structural reform that prevented the same architecture from being used again. The Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act was passed in 1978, creating a court to oversee domestic intelligence operations. It was a real reform. It was also a court whose proceedings are entirely classified, whose rulings are secret, and whose very existence as an oversight mechanism depends entirely on the honesty of the agencies it oversees. The lesson the government took from MKUltra was not, "This must never happen again." The lesson was, the paperwork must be harder to find. The National Security Act provisions that allowed the CIA to conduct domestic operations without congressional knowledge were not repealed after MKUltra. The authority to classify documents indefinitely, including documents related to programs that harmed American citizens, was not restructured. The use of front organizations to route funding through academic and medical institutions in ways that obscure the actual sponsor remains, by the CIA's own public guidelines, a permitted operational technique. What changed after 1977 was not the capability. What changed was the awareness that capability had limits. Only if someone found the boxes. The Canadian government's 1988 settlement with Cameron's victims established something important in legal terms. It acknowledged, for the first time on the record, that a foreign government bore partial responsibility for what happened to its own citizens inside its own hospitals, because it had accepted CIA money without adequate oversight. The Canadian Senate report that preceded the settlement used language that still reads as remarkable. The victims had been subjected to procedures that stripped them of their identity. Not metaphorically, clinically, documented, compensated. The McGill University Hospital where Cameron worked still exists. The Allen Memorial Institute still operates as a psychiatric facility. There is a plaque on the wall acknowledging the history of the experiments. Patients are still admitted there. The Addiction Research Center in Lexington, Kentucky, another MKUltra site, operated as a federal narcotic treatment facility where prisoners were given drugs in exchange for reduced sentences until 1974. It has since been repurposed. There is no plaque. Sidney Gottlieb retired from the CIA in 1972, 1 year before Helms ordered the files destroyed. He moved to a farm in rural Virginia, raised goats, did volunteer work in a hospice, and practiced folk dancing. He was deposed in several civil lawsuits related to MKUltra. He died in 1999, never having been charged with a crime. His security clearance was never revoked. The question MKUltra forces, the one that doesn't have a clean answer, is not whether governments are capable of doing this. We know they are. The documents prove it. The question is what structural condition made it possible, and whether that condition was ever actually removed. The 1977 hearings identified the problem as a lack of oversight. They created oversight mechanisms that are themselves classified. Someone approved every single subproject. The question is whether those signatures still exist. There is a particular kind of comfort in calling something a conspiracy theory. It creates distance. It signals sophistication. It tells the person saying it, and the person hearing it, that they are too intelligent to be manipulated, too grounded to fall for something that isn't real. MKUltra was called a conspiracy theory for 24 years. From 1953, when the program began, to 1977, when a CIA employee accidentally found the boxes while looking for retirement files. For 24 years, anyone who claimed the United States government was running mind control experiments on its own citizens without their knowledge or consent was, by the standards of reasonable public discourse, a conspiracy theorist. Then the boxes turned up, and the conspiracy theory became a Senate hearing, became testimony under oath, became 16,000 pages of budget authorizations and payment records and project summaries, became presidential apologies and government settlements, and a plaque on a wall in Montreal. What didn't change is the part worth sitting with. The program wasn't run by monsters in the cinematic sense, men who twirled mustaches and laughed at suffering. It was run by administrators, by scientists with PhDs and institutional affiliations and peer-reviewed publications, by people who went home at night, had families, filed taxes, and believed, with apparent sincerity, that what they were doing was necessary. That is not a more comforting version of the story. That is a more accurate one. The distance between a democracy and a program that drugs its own citizens without consent is not as wide as we prefer to believe. It is, as MKUltra demonstrated, precisely as wide as the gap between a classified budget authorization and a box of retirement files stored in the wrong building. 40 years after the Senate hearings, the 80% of documents that Helms destroyed remain gone. The full scope of what was tested, on whom, with what lasting effects, that accounting does not exist. It was shredded in January 1973 over the course of a single morning before anyone thought to look. The patients in Montreal who woke up not knowing their children's names, some of them recovered, partially. Some did not. The ones who didn't leave behind families who spent decades trying to get answers from institutions that had already decided the answers were not in the public interest. Eric Olson spent 66 years asking what happened to his father. He never found out. The file is still partially redacted. This is not ancient history. The church committee that investigated MKUltra also investigated COINTELPRO, the FBI program that surveilled and actively disrupted civil rights organizations, anti-war groups, and political figures deemed inconvenient. Both programs were confirmed. Neither resulted in criminal prosecutions. Both used institutional frameworks that remain, in modified form, legally available today. We did not fix the condition. We renamed it. If a program this large, this documented, this institutionally embedded could operate for 20 years without public knowledge, the question isn't whether it happened. The question is what's in the boxes we haven't found yet. If MKUltra ran for 20 years before anyone found the right filing cabinet, what else are we still getting wrong? Tell me in the comments. Next week, we uncover the island meeting that wrote the rules of American money, and the 7 men who were never supposed to be in the same room. The file is never fully closed. It's just waiting for someone to check the wrong building.